You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
I guess this first part of the conversation, I just want to take kind of a big picture, just kind of 3 questions I want to put out here, and we can tackle them. 1, how real is the issue of Jews feeling ambivalent toward or alienated from Israel? Who and or what is to blame? And what can and should be done about it? Peter, as I said, you're sort of responsible for us being here, so why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Well, thanks. I am genuinely really grateful to be invited to be on this panel. I think the crisis is real, but I think there are 2 very different crises, a mass crisis and an elite crisis. The elite crisis, which shows up in most of the data, which shows that young American Jews under 35 or 40 are less attached to Israel than their parents and grandparents, is not primarily about Israeli politics. It's primarily about attachment to Judaism. When you have a population that is simply less and less of non-Orthodox young American Jews who are simply less and less attached to Judaism, it's not surprising that they are less and less attached to Israel. If they're not interested and know very little about Simchas Torah, you wouldn't expect them to know a lot and be very connected to Israel. So that problem, I think, can only be addressed at the level of Jewish education. We are arguably the wealthiest and most Jewishly illiterate community in Jewish history, even compared to other diaspora communities like Canada or Australia or Britain. American Jews don't have access to academically excellent, affordable, full-time Jewish schools in nearly the same way that they do in many of the other large diaspora communities. And that is, I think, the fundamental reason that you see this lack of attachment to Judaism, and Israel is simply one part of that. But there is another story, and it is an elite story outside the Orthodox community. Nothing I'm talking about applies to the Orthodox community, where you have a totally different story going on. If you look at the emerging leadership of the non-Orthodox American Jewish community, people who are graduating, young Reform, conservative Reconstructionist rabbis, the independent Minyanim movement, which is the people who are creating Jewish social justice organizations. There's an enormous amount of very, very exciting stuff going on in terms of Jewish renewal. These are people who are deeply Jewishly committed, and they are, many of them, politically alienated over Israel. You can see it in the study that Avichai did in 2010 of what they called young non-establishment Jewish leaders. You can see it in the poll that JTS just did of their rabbis, where they found that older conservative rabbis were 48 points more likely to favor AIPAC over J Street, and younger conservative recent graduates were 16 points more likely to favor J Street, a huge political shift. You can see it in the study that the independent Minyanim did of its own members, where they found that a very high percentage of them said they did not always feel proud of Israel. Overwhelming percentage of them said they supported a settlement freeze. And here, I think the question, the essential question is, can American Jews whose Zionism is not based on Israel as refuge, because it's very important to remember that the American Jewish community became a Zionist community overwhelmingly in the 30s and 40s because what happened in Europe and America's unwillingness to let European Jews in made the case in a very palpable way for the fact that you needed a Jewish state as refuge. For young American Jews who don't see any diaspora community in the world that needs Israel as refuge and don't feel the need themselves, the questions of the character of the Jewish state become more central to the very question of whether they identify as Zionists at all. And that's, I think, at the core of why you see this mounting alienation and willingness to question even fundamental questions about the rationale for a Jewish state amongst even those highly Jewishly committed young American Jews.
Every generation does have their relationship with Israel, and it's not our responsibility to dictate what that is to the next generation. And we need to allow them the space to do that. We can't treat the young people like they don't know any better, and that's why they're thinking the way they are. And we also can't assume that as they grow older, their positions are going to change. And I would add that in addition to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I really think young American or North American Jews are concerned with issues of religious pluralism, issues of how the Bedouin communities are treated. I've had a student answer the question, how do you advocate for Israel? And the way they do that is by supporting women of the wall. And we need to allow that to be acceptable within our advocacy terminology in the organized community.
When I was in college in the 80s, there was a book I read by Dr. Joyce Starr that talked about the U.S.-Israel relation called Kissing Through Glass. And it talked about the fact that we didn't really know each other. We weren't really in a relationship. We had stereotypes of one another. And what I see is very, very different from the students who we work with, from the over 300,000 young people who have traveled in this past decade to Israel and met with Israelis and have a relationship now with people there who they've met with and understand. A relationship about love is different than infatuation. In the past, perhaps, our community was infatuated with the narrative of Exodus, not so much the Exodus of the Bible, but maybe the Exodus of Leon Uris, or of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed star depicting Exodus. This generation, certainly, who was born after 1990, is not part of that same narrative. But these folks are coming back, and they are absolutely falling in love. They are falling in love, and as we all know as adults in this room, love is messy. Love is a relationship. You have arguments. You disagree. You see each other without makeup. You get over those things, but you continue a loving relationship. Now, that's not a fairy tale love, but it's a relationship that requires actually being in a conversation with one another. That's the Israel that I fell in love with as a young adult. That's the Israel that I see motivating the stories, the concerns, the issues, which include the hard questions being asked by young people, which I think everyone on this panel from different perspectives would agree. Young people ask hard questions. They don't want to just sit and listen to people up here tell them what their narrative should be about Israel. They have their own feelings. They have their own understandings. But I just want to share this one data point, and we'll talk a lot about that, I'm sure, over the course of the panel. If you look at the birthright data of these hundreds of thousands of people encountering Israel for the first time, without a lot of background, and I agree with Peter in the idea that they don't have a strong Jewish background, a lot of these folks. This is indeed one of the aspects of this. This is an introduction. This is Judaism 101 for many of them. But when they go, what is the favorite thing that sticks with them? What is sticky from their experience? Is it Masada? No, it's actually the Mifgash. It's the meeting with Israeli young soldiers. It's the real-life narratives, not the fairy tale narratives. And that's, I think, really significant as we think about how are we going to reach this generation. We know it's not fact sheets they're looking for, debating points. We know from this program we do with the Jewish Agency, where we bring on 50 campus Israeli fellows, that they actually are enjoying meeting and learning about the lives of young Israelis. This is the beginning of a real serious loving relationship. But yeah, it's going to be messy.
Too often, there's an easy association between being pro-Israel and supportive of the policies of the Israeli government. I think there is not enough space created for people who say That for me, being pro-Israel is being in solidarity with the principles of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which promises complete equality of social and political rights, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. And that forces me into profound conflict with an occupation that has lasted for 2/3 of Israel's existence and desecrates those ideals by not giving citizenship to Palestinians in the West Bank. Secondly, I think that in the effort to create red lines, lines about who is kosher and who isn't kosher, there is a profound imbalance, which is to say, if you question Israel's existence as a Jewish state, let me just stipulate, I don't. I'm a Zionist. I believe in Israel as a democratic Jewish state. But I believe it is harmful to draw a red line around Israel as a Jewish state if you're not also going to draw a red line around Israel as a democratic Jewish state, because I don't believe that Israel can survive as a non-democratic Jewish state. And if Israel permanently, essentially annexes the West Bank, it will be, in large measure, a non-democratic Jewish state, as both Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert have warned. So if you're going to be machmir about people who have questions, about questions that are also deep in our tradition, right? The same questions that Henrietta Schultz had, who founded Hadassah, the same questions that Judah Magnus had, founder of Hebrew University, the same questions that Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber had. If you don't want their descendants in the table, okay, at the table, fine. But then what are you going to tell me about the people, representatives from Likud? Because Likud Party's platform says explicitly there will be no Palestinian state, which means, to my mind, ultimately their vision is not of a democratic Jewish state. So I think if we have to recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, as it says in Israel's Declaration of Independence, which stresses liberal democratic values every bit as much as it stresses its Jewish identity. And if we're going to take one seriously, we have to take the other one equally seriously.
I would like some of that next generation in the group up here sharing with you why, for example, for them, they're very comfortable going to a J Street conference and an AIPAC conference. And as I said, loyalty to brands, and that may seem strange to some people in this room, but I am absolutely telling you, I could put numerous students up here who would explain to you, they're interested in hearing lots of interesting perspectives, and they think it's really actually sort of cool that our community has all these passionate people talking about Israel, and they'd like to form their own opinions. And by the way, if we're going to have everybody in the room, also who I'd like to see up here are Israelis on the panel. We should not be talking about Israel as a third party if we're in a loving relationship. Israelis are not the object of this discussion. They are our partners in our mishpacha in this conversation, and they need to be talking to us about what their tents mean in their society at this moment and how that is an expression of Jewish and democratic, because I don't think we completely get that. I think those are some of the discussions that I find from students to be the ones that suggest to them that it is not just a black and white thing. It's just not one organizational position or the other. And it's not even planks in the political parties of particular Israeli parties that is what sort of inspires them. What inspires them are people. What inspires them are being part of the conversation. And the more we invite them into the tent and show the community that we're not looking for ways to exclude them or judge them or have litmus tests about them, the more vibrant that conversation will be. And I think it'll make critics on all sides of the issue potentially have to rethink some of their strategies.
I guess the question that comes to mind when I hear discussions like we need to have a relationship with Israelis and we need to have Israeli voices is how you're defining Israelis. Because if you're defining the West Bank, the Palestinians of the West Bank have been under Israeli sovereignty since 1967. So to my mind, that makes them, whether we like it or not, until the day there is a Palestinian state, Israelis. There's only one state that has sovereignty and dominion over their lives. That's the state of Israel. What does it mean?
Wait, is that
what does it mean?
International law? You're claiming they're Israeli citizens?
No, they're not Israeli citizens, but Israel is the state that controls much of their lives. So the question is, when you talk about being in relationship with Israelis, does that mean that we have an obligation also to hear about those non-citizens who are under Israeli sovereignty? And if it does, and I think it actually should, then I think it makes the red lines that we're trying to establish very, very difficult. Even if you want to bring Israeli Arab citizens into the conversation, you're very likely going to be bringing in non-Zionist voices because, newsflash, most Israeli Arab citizens are non-Zionist. So if one defines Israeli as something other than Jewish Israeli, then I think it makes the kind of conversation that you want to have and the red lines that one wants to establish actually more difficult.
Peter, you started by saying you consider yourself a Zionist, and you started by saying you believe in a Jewish and democratic state. So, just to clarify, your sense is that to have a conversation about Israel today would require...
There's a 20% of Israel's own population are people who have profound problems with Zionism. I don't. I'm a Zionist. If you want to have a conversation with Israelis, and you don't only mean Jewish Israelis, but you mean all Israelis, even if you only mean within the Green Line, then it seems to me that conversation may be incompatible with saying we will not bring any non-Zionists or any pro-BDS people to come speak with us. I say this as someone who's against BDS and against and a Zionist, but I'm simply saying that so much of our language has certain hidden assumptions that I think gloss over the really hard questions.
We want to throw it out to the audience, and we want to start with at least several questions from audience members, let's say under 30.
Hi, my name is Sam Avishai. I'm a freshman at UC Berkeley, so this is a very pressing and on-topic issue. I'm just wondering, a lot of you use the word Zionist, what Zionism means to you, and if you feel that this is a time when we need to redefine what Zionism means.
For me, Zionism means a democratic Jewish state in some part of the biblical land of Israel. But I think, and that makes me a political Zionist in the tradition of Theodor Herzl, but I actually think one of the things that's interesting and emerging and will be, I think, very, very challenging to the American Jewish community in the next decade or so, if we have essentially the continued march towards a permanent one-state reality between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, and the increasing receding of the horizon of the possibility of a Palestinian state, will be more and more young American Jews will start to say, I'm actually a cultural Zionist in the tradition of Echad Ha'am, and I believe, therefore, that I can, like the people who are in the youth group Hashomer Hatzair, or like Martin Buber, and therefore I believe that I can be a Zionist and still support some kind of secular binational entity. Again, that's not my view. But that view, which has a deep pedigree in Zionist history, will gain traction precisely to the degree that Israel cannot remain a Jewish democratic state because its occupation of the West Bank becomes permanent.
For me, I identify really strongly with my Judaism through peoplehood. And so Zionism has always been a natural connection, that this is the land of my people. Which goes actually to things that you've been talking about brand identity and you know what that means to me as a young adult that grew up. I would say I'm the exception, not the rule, having gone to Jewish day school and having traveled to Israel as a young person, and I'd actually add to that having Holocaust survivors as grandparents, and so understanding the need for a refuge in the land of Israel, despite the fact that it may not have been in my generation. Because I grew up seeing what that did to my grandparents and then my father and down the road. So having, but something that I also struggled with as a young adult growing up in San Francisco, which celebrates multiculturalism and diversity, was dealing with how do I balance both? How do I love my people? How do I love being part of a Jewish community that is exclusive in a lot of ways, but also is part of the greater fabric of a general community? And that's, I guess that's my roundabout answer to what my Zionism is.
Anyone that knows Zionist history knows that there were great debates and discussions about it, and we shouldn't shy away from that. I want people to know who Echad Ha'am is. I want those discussions to inform. But actually, I'm going to make the case and want to draw a historic reference point, not to pre-state and state, but actually deeper in our Jewish history, and that is the destruction of the temple. Because at times, I get real concern when people ask me what keeps me up at night is when our community itself, in having these kind of discussions, starts tearing each other apart and starts not just excluding people, but beating up and blaming students, young people who are asking questions, etc. There's a very well-known essay written by a guy named Jonathan Swift in 1729 called The Modest Proposal. There's a line that says, while their holy city Jerusalem was burning, the Jews were busy killing themselves. And it really is instructive, I think, in this day and age, that we figure out how we tell our children, not only that we don't plan on eating them and selling them, but that we want them deeply involved in figuring out your question that you're asking us, what is Zionism going to mean? What does it mean now that you've tasted Israel, that you've have your own opinions formed, that you want to build relationships, that you want to be a part of a vibrant community that is connected to an Israel, but it's a narrative that looks a little bit different than the movies and the books that preceded your period of time. So we want your stories, we want your insights, we want you to be a part of helping develop this narrative, and I think we need to make some adjustments in how we're having this conversation in a more humane way.
Julie, I'd throw to you. I mean, on the one hand, your day job is really like, no matter what people feel about open debate, et cetera, there are clearly forces out there, and I'm sure Peter would concede it, that are not coming at Israel from a perspective of respect, love, a belief in the Jewish state. They really have animus and delegitimization as their goal, and that's your frontline job, to fight that. But at the same time, you're talking about the need to allow Jewish students to sort of connect and deal with issues. We talked about Bedouins, all sorts of issues. So how does the community, how do you balance that in your job, and how should the community balance that overall? There's forces out there that are really trying to delegitimize Israel, but they're our own people who love Israel and have really tough questions, and both those things are going on at the same time.
I think that there's a lot of fear that if we do open the conversation, that we're going to lose support from the next generation, but I would argue that if we don't open the conversation, we're going to lose their support because they want to wrestle with these ideas. They want to talk about them. They want to be challenged. In terms of policies, though, two things. First of all, I think that most of the young Americans don't know anything about Israeli politics other than what they see on TV, or as one of my friends said, on Jon Stewart. That's probably where they get the majority of their news. And so that's one thing, it's like, how do we engage them in learning about the policies? And the second thing is, I have another friend that always says, and she's actually from Europe, that says, why do American Jews think that they can affect policy in Israel? So can we separate those two issues between debating what Israel does and trying to change their policies from this country?
And Peter, I would just flip the question to you and say, you spend a lot of time, you're focusing on Israeli government policy, kind of the establishment Jewish community, but how do you wrestle and respond with the fact that you are here talking, and you can talk about the Israeli government any way you want, but if the Prime Minister had been here, we may have had people who would come in and heckle him and disrupt, and that there's a group on the left that's not dedicated to civil debate. There's political movements that are truly, taking aim at Israel in a way, and in some ways benefiting from those who would, like yourself, who support Israel but want a big tent and open debate. How do we respond? What is the response, if any, in that direction? What do you do to counter that?
At the risk of repeating myself, I believe that when you look at the question of delegitimization and how to defeat delegitimization, and believe me, I want to defeat Israel's delegitimization as much as anyone in this room. I want Israel to remain a Jewish state for my children and grandchildren as much as anyone in this room. But where I might differ with some people is that I believe that at the core of Israel's legitimacy is the fact that it was founded as a democratic Jewish state. And delegitimization of Israel will rise in direct proportion to the degree that people believe that Israel is no longer living up to its own founding principles. That if Israel can become again a country that offers citizenship to everyone in its borders, irrespective of race, religion, sex, and ethnicity, it will not need PR firms. Because although there will still be hardcore anti-Semites and lunatics all out there, Israel will be able to pro-Israel people will be able to go into any room, debate anyone, and win. Because democracy is the language of our time. Democracy is the lingua franca of our time, as you can see even in the Arab world. If Israel makes the occupation permanent and becomes in some fundamental way not a democratic state, You can get 100 PR firms, and you will gradually lose that debate, and it will more and more empower those people who believe that the creation of a Jewish state was a mistake to begin with.
Delegitimization is not a debate. Delegitimization are people who are supporting positions that will destroy the state of Israel. That is their intent. They are a network of people who are promoting the destruction of Israel, maybe for political aims, that they may have their own valid narrative and whatever to do it. It is a bad thing. It is not a debate between right and wrong. Debate between right and wrong and different views and different ways to do it, etc., can happen in a room. But the Israeli government, it's not for the Israeli government to tell us which questions that we should be having in discussion with students and which ones they're allowed to ask and which policies they should change in order to have a better brand. The brand of Israel that young people will develop will come from, they have the transparent to ask all the hard questions, to criticize, to look at the Israeli human rights groups, they have that information available. They don't need the Israeli government to give them permission to ask questions about it or to challenge it, etc. Israel's a democracy, and that is the strongest thing we have against delegitimization. What we're missing, and both, I think, in the institutional world as well as from the government, is an understanding that the way in which these young people would ask questions would be difficult. How many people in the room here have some ties to the University of Michigan in some form or another? Quite a few. Last night, we gave an award to the University of Michigan Hillel, so you should all kvel. And we gave it to them about how they have been engaging their peers in such creative ways, and not just one-off programming, come have a falafel with us and come see a movie in a superficial way, or even come to a political debate. They've actually created a program there called Tamid, where they're asking people to look and invest in different aspects of Israeli society. And by the way, they are not prejudging that some of those investments may need to go to Arab towns to play for a soccer field or other municipal needs or whatever, or that there aren't real legitimate needs and concerns and discrepancies in Israeli society. But let's distinguish this. It is not the role of young people to be taking directions from any government. They're not going to. That's the worst way in the world to get people to love and develop a relationship.
I think it's important for us to remember when we talk about BDS that David Grossman supports a form of BDS, that Amos Oz supports a form of BDS, that Aleph Bet Yerushalmi, all of them have said they will not play the Ariel Cultural Center in the West Bank. And so it seems to me there is a very important need to distinguish between people who would boycott, divest, and sanction from the entire state of Israel, and people precisely because they believe in Israel as a Jewish democratic state want to distinguish between the degree to which they invest in democratic Israel and do not invest in non-democratic Israel. And if you don't allow, the Israeli government is trying hard to erase that distinction, if you look at the recent legislation. But if the American Jewish community doesn't make that distinction, then you will at some point have to explain to someone how you allow David Grossman to come to speak at your organization.
And just to clarify, nobody at Hillel is preventing Amos Oz or David Grossman or Aleph Bet Yehoshua from coming to talk.
Quite the contrary. If any of their press agents are in the room, I want them on every Hillel. I want every student to have read their novels and to be conversant in it, and that will enhance our discussion. And I am concerned, Peter, as you are. There is a challenge about the internal conversation among Israelis. That's a family conversation that's taking place, and those individuals are luminaries in Israeli society that are people who have to be a part of our narrative, and our students have to know their passions and concerns. I'm a little bit concerned if it's not somehow contextualized, a conversation that's taking place with tremendous nuance. And again, we love to think, and I suspect that there are a lot of folks in this room like myself who are, political junkies and follow every UN resolution in every aspect. That's not where most students are. That's not what is going to impact on them directly. But, to be perfectly honest, if I could get students to read David Grossman's, novel, To the Ends of the Land, that would be a great victory on many levels.
One thing that I think I notice on college campuses is the non-unity of pro-Israel groups, and I think you could actually talk to the Berkeley student over there. They have like 5 different groups on Israel. And I think a problem that maybe you could answer to address is this disunity creates voices that turn people off. And there's some Jewish extremist voice. That's one thing we're always worried about. You know, there's this Israel Apartheid Week. Sometimes the counter-protests to that are just as extreme, and this ends up turning a lot of the school community off of both. They're just saying both of these cultures are absolutely nuts, is what they say. And it does isolate some Jewish students because they say, I don't want to be that extreme, I don't want to be ingrained in this. I'm pro-Israel, but I'm not going to even, you know, jump into the bandwagon. I don't want to involve myself in this. So how do you guys answer to different extremists on campus that are maybe isolating other students?
I actually think there is room on campus for all voices on Israel, and I think that if Berkeley Hillel wants to have 10 groups that in some way or another engage with Israel, that's a good thing. I have no problem with that. And I think that we need to reckon in terms of extremists, all communities have extremists, and we need to push them to the margins, even if they're within our own communities.
Your question reminds me that at least for the past decade, the students have been in front of us on this. I remember meeting with a group of students at Yale when I first started doing this work in 2002, right after the Second Intifada, and there was a lot of propaganda running around the campus. And I met with a group of students there who said, you know, when we look at the materials that are, you know, on the both sides of this, we're actually embarrassed. And so at the time, they decided to self-form into a group that would create what they called the Yale Israel Journal at the time. They said, we want to invite in different voices, not one voice. We think that on this campus anyway, the best way to inform people is to do it with a vehicle that will speak and people will be able to read it, but we want to take ownership of this issue. That was 10 years ago. By the way, they didn't know how to do a journal at the time, so they asked a guy on the faculty if he'd be willing to serve as he was a visiting professor at the time. His name was Michael Oren. And that was before he was a household name in the community. But that's one of those examples where I think when students ask for resources in a certain way, we can really, and the Yale Israel Journal is 10 years old. The project I told you about with Tamid started in 2008. The students have shown us that they've learned about transition and succession and all the issues that we discuss in our organizational world. Again, it would not, you know, it's paternalistic to think that they don't have some insights, particularly as it relates to campus, as to what may work here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's actually, you know, what we need to do and what the Israel Action Network is doing is seizing the middle ground. We have lost this conversation to the extremists. And, you know, while you can have a variety of voices, we really need to focus on getting back to the moderates, and we are the majority who don't, and that should be the goal, whether on campus or in our communities.
My name is Solomon Grunwald. I'm a rabbi here in Denver. We've talked about a lot about college students. I work with a lot of young adults in their mid-20s to 40. Actually, a few months ago, we sat down and read Peter's article from the New York Review. And I expected a very contentious debate about it. But when we were done, they looked at each other and said, yep, he hit it right on. Their complaints are that there's not enough room in the community for an open, diverse conversation about Israel. Even those on the political right wanted more inclusion and debate and inquiry. So my question to you is, from your experience, your travels around the country, knowing what's going on, what are some concrete things that communities can do, some steps that they can take to open up the conversation, to start having a more, and include more of those young adults in their late 20s and 30s? Any of you? Yeah.
I mean, I would say, I think the two most important things that the American Jewish community can do is first, make it possible for people to have a strong Jewish education. Because I think your ability to engage and understand and love Israel is going to be dramatically, dramatically harder if you don't have some sense of knowledge of, fascination with, and joy in Judaism. And it seems to me some of this problem is simply that more fundamental problem. Some people always talk about how hard it is for people to speak about Israel, but I actually sometimes feel that it's actually harder for American Jews to speak about how much we failed in terms, outside the Orthodox community, in terms of how much we failed in instilling knowledge of joy in and fascination in Judaism. But beyond that, I think the best thing you can do is to send and make it possible for American Jewish kids to go to Israel. But when I say Israel, I mean all the territory under Israel's domain, some parts of which I wish were not under Israeli sovereignty. That's Israel. The people there may not be Israeli citizens, but it's Israel. Israel is under, we have to take ownership of the fact that until the day that a Palestinian state is created, that is Israel. And so, yes, send people to the Kotel, send people to the beach in Tel Aviv, send them to have all those experiences, but also do the kind of things, the amazing things that Encounter does, for instance, which is to say, send people to see what it's like to live under occupation every single day. If you're and to see that the people living under occupation are in many ways at root just like you. And I think the kids who I find, and young adults who I find, who are the most compelling and give me the greatest hope and inspiration for the future are those who had a strong Jewish education and those who have seen the other Israel as well. It's often a very bitter, difficult, painful experience, but it seems to me that's the beginning of the change we need.
I mean, what I find interesting about your question is, you started out by saying you're a rabbi in the community, you work with young people, you had a session, you read Peter's article. What's wrong with that model? I mean, I think it's great if you can bolster education and send everybody to Israel, super. But in the meantime, what's the barrier to bringing an assortment of voices, having that conversation? I mean, I'm throwing it back at you a little bit. You asked the question, so what's the problem? Like, what stops you from doing this? Do you feel pressure in one way or another? I mean, you're doing it.
I mean, the barriers are in what Peter calls the establishment Jewish leadership. I mean, we met in a coffee house to talk about Peter's article. We didn't, have it at the JCC or in a synagogue. So, I mean, yeah, there are little steps like that. But what have you seen that the establishment can do? One of the comments that I got was about paternalism, that they feel like the leaders of the community treat them like they're too delicate to, that they need to be protected from critics. Because if we allow people to speak, critically of Israel, that it'll influence people and break down unity in the community. At least here in Denver, we haven't seen, that there's a diversity of groups at the table so far. I think that we're on the verge of some changes here.
So I would help, if you have young people who want to do programming or want to have certain kind of discussions, you're in a position to march those people into the Federation office in Denver or whatever synagogues or institutions saying, here are a group of young people, they have an idea of programming they want, and take it from there.
Thank you.
We're here at JFNA having a conversation about Peter's article in the establishment, and so I hope that you are not afraid to have that conversation again inside of your synagogue instead of in a coffee shop.
I'm John Ruskay from New York. This is a long conversation. We've had many of them throughout, so for fear of repeating myself, I think Peter, you put the issue about how do we engage the middle in a very powerful way, and I just want to argue, in my view, we're dealing with a 60-year problem of having conflated Israel education and advocacy. For 60 years, the North American Jewish community has fundamentally mobilized our community to stand with Israel, to march with Israel, to rally Israel. We've asked American Jewry, totally understandably, to come out and stand with the people of Israel. Pre-48, as Peter alluded to earlier and others did, there was huge debate about what this state should be, could be, might be. It all closed down, understandably, when the Arab armies came to try to wipe it off, 67, 73, beyond. The truth is, that was 60 years. It's going to take a long time, but I call it a chiropractic readjustment, to understand that Israel advocacy, which we must do, when Israel's in crisis, to stand with them, to let the people know we're with them. But Israel education, which will be critical for the middle, which, in my view, helps young and old, this is not only a young problem, develop their own views, conflicting views, on what Israel can be, should be, and might be. And to do that, one has to have in our institutions, in synagogues, in JCCs, in other places, to really understand that we want to help you develop a different view on what should be dealing with the Palestinian issue, what should be dealing with the ongoing issue of religion and state in Israel. And you really need to believe that we would be a stronger community if people end up with Shalom Achshav or ZOA, because that leads to a kind of engagement and passion about what this place has been. For 60 years, we've basically said, come rally and cheer. And for a whole lot of reasons, for the reasons we know for the last 20 years, the visuals have been more problematic. When we first were kids, Israel represented to every single person the actualization of every value we had. For all the reasons, that has not been the case for the last 20 and 30 years. And therefore, we really need a fundamental change, easier said than done. I think my own notion was to develop courses which I call Wrestling with Israel, which are first needed for rabbis, for Jewish communal professionals, for Jewish leadership. This is not only a problem of the young. This is a problem of people who are trying to wrestle, who care deeply about the Jewish people, who want to be able to identify, but in my view, we actually haven't provided them the means to get in. We asked them to sort of to wrestle about everything else. So this is a long-term, huge issue. The very fact that we're having a session like this, we had others previously, is, in my view, there's a growing recognition of the need to do that. How to do it? Not so easy. Some of us have been involved in, what would a course like that begin with? Wrestling with Israel. Where do you start? You start with Torah? You start with Balfour? Is it about Jewish identity? I'm using it. So this is a long-term issue, but the good news from a session like this, in my view, is that there's a growing recognition. This is not about right or left. This is actually about how to re-engage the middle, how to re-engage, and that's both young and old, in my view.
If I could just say something very briefly, I think one of the fundamental differences between Israel education and Israel advocacy is that when you're involved in advocacy, you get people like Frank Luntz to come up with intellectually dishonest, poll-tested phrases that you think will sound good in winning a debate, but are not actually going to, alienate people who are thinking critically. And I wanted to mention that because I think one of them was just mentioned, and that's UDI. Which all of a sudden I started hearing constantly. First of all, it seemed to me that idea, someone got the brilliant idea that that would evoke the white Rhodesian government's declaration of independence from Britain. I mean, come on. This is the kind of thing that cheap political consultants do. Secondly, however you feel about the Palestinian bid at the UN, I think it has significant problems. It may not be bilateral, but my goodness sakes, when you get 150 countries supporting you, it's not unilateral. It's just intellectually dishonest speech, and precisely the kind of thing that is likely to alienate the most thoughtful, critically minded young American Jews.
You were going to respond to his question.
No, that was my response.
Hi, my name is Donna. I'm a student, so I know that everyone's been talking about us, so I just kind of wanted to give my reflection. I go to University of Maryland. I'm a junior, birthright alum, come from an Israeli family, former president of Terrapin Students for Israel. I just want to say that from my experience, like I grew up in a very Zionist home, like Israeli family, alum of all these different Israel advocacy programs, and I feel like a lot of everything that I've been told growing up, at least on an intellectual level, I kind of agree that, at least from taking Middle East policy classes and reading the news, a lot of it has just not been honest and not been true. And I honestly feel a little bit betrayed sometimes when I read the news and I read, I agree with what you were saying, Peter, that I just haven't been told the honest truth. And I think that I also agree with you were saying, how a lot of adults, it's a problem with everyone, because what I've been told by my parents in my synagogue and just growing up just hasn't been the complete, honest truth. And so I think that there needs to be a start from the top, and if we're going to educate children and younger people, that we need to start being honest with our children and our families because we can't expect change to come from the bottom.
The student over there, I don't know your name, but I'm so glad that you had the courage to stand up and speak to this crowd, and we need more of your voices, and we need more students to have the courage to be able, I heard a quiver in your voice that actually resonated with me, both from a personal perspective, but I used to teach at the largest Jewish community high school in North America as a Jewish history teacher, and I've seen so many students leave our system and then feel like they've been through a snow job. And it's because we're afraid to actually talk about the real issues. And the founder of our organization, who's sitting right over there, is a rabbi, and she's sitting surrounded by a whole group of alumni of students that really want to grapple with the harder pieces of this conflict, and not because they want to walk away from the community, and not because they want to walk away from Israel, because they love Israel, and they want us to honor them intellectually and be able to let them grapple with narratives and claims that they're not getting in our Jewish institutions. And so I just want to put that out there. I invite all of you to come and either speak to me or Melissa Weintraub, who's sitting right over there, or any of our alumni, and come and talk to us either about the trips where we actually create a Jewish identity affirming environment within which you can go and meet Palestinians. You don't have to come out all thinking the same. We're not trying to convince you of a political agenda. We're saying that if you want to actually talk about this intellectually, you have to be able to see things from another perspective. And that's also what we're trying to do with schools, to answer the very challenge that you put in front of us, which is to say, let's honor our students' intellectual curiosity and be able to bring it to them in those environments.
There's a real irony that given all the interest in this topic, that particularly at universities, we have found the universities which hold themselves out to be the marketplace of ideas, where you're going to have rich discussion with nuance and with depth to it, that are going to allow students to ask probing questions and really answer them. And in many places, we found, because of the bias of Middle East study centers, because of professors who are allowed to get away with teaching the history with maps that they invent, or maps that are not historically accurate, because they have a political view. Not that that political view can't be discussed, but that they do so with such an agenda that it doesn't provide for the kind of deep inquiry. It's a real concern, and students are smart and they catch it. And that's why not only can they not feel like they walk away from a Jewish education or a university education only to read an article in Haaretz or something later to find out, wait a second, I didn't know this was going on. We have to take very seriously, and I want to relate to John's point about wrestling. We've said through Birthright, we have an engagement strategy. We're going to introduce a lot of people into the Birthright conversation. And we've said we need an advocacy strategy, because we recognize that there are some folks out there with ill intent, and we need to address those BDS people and not merely just do it. But what about this center in the middle? What is our commitment to an investment to a serious a curriculum and dialogue? And you're right, I think, Ami, that it's not necessarily barriers, and maybe we have to build the kind of forums that allow and showcase the kind of deep discussions that don't shame people, particularly students, for asking questions that are on their mind or of great concern, but actually allow Jewish educators to think that it is part of their mission, part of their training, part of their job to be able to facilitate those discussions, not only facilitate their own views on the Israel issue, which unfortunately I want to share is also one of the problems that is out there. So I think we need to look at some kind of, not a universal curriculum, but we need to create, and I think this can be done not only top down, I think it could be done bottom up. And we should be having the kind of forums, and maybe there is something to be learned from the lessons of the early Zionist debates. Maybe we can recapture some of that by saying that having deep discussions that include disagreements, that include views sometimes even that we don't want to hear, will actually make the conversation deeper, richer, and more authentic.
I don't think that this is a left-of-center conversation. I think what's not here are people who aren't willing to listen. I'm not here to represent my personal ideology. I'm here to say that the way forward is to allow conversation to be had. And you know, and that's more what I want to push out there, is that, you know, it's not about cutting, it's not right or left. It's about opening space where it needs to be opened and creating safe space.
I would just say, in terms of thinking about this question of what a curriculum, what this education would be, I mean, I think it seems to me the standard should be that there should be no course offered or program offered within the American Jewish community that deals with Israel that does not have Palestinian voices. You simply can't have any pretension towards a serious education about the issue without hearing from Palestinian voices, and that means you're going to hear from non-Zionist voices. It means you're going to hear, there were also plenty of Jewish non-Zionist or anti-Zionist voices too. And I think it's precisely if you want to have your young students be able to make the case for a Jewish democratic state, that they should have heard those voices. Because in fact, they will only be, I think, effective advocates for a Jewish democratic state if they understand the arguments against it, and they also understand the human pain that is involved in those people who have suffered from the creation of a state that for us has been such a miracle.
Can I ask, I mean, not that we have any influence over the Palestinian American community, but would you agree that that in reverse needs to happen as well?
I don't think that I'm sure that you're right that the Palestinian organizations are not giving Zionism a fair shake. That's probably entirely true, and they should. But it seems to me we should have our own standards about intellectual honesty that is not dependent on what anyone else does.
I just want to say thank you to Jewish Federations for allowing, hosting this conversation, for everybody in the audience for participating. Hopefully, if you visit JTA.org, you can see the conversation continue, read Peter's book, and kudos to Hillel and the Israel Action Network.
We're now standing after the discussion here at the GA, and I think that many people in this room felt that the most poignant question or comment raised was by Dana Corin, who's a student at the University of Maryland. And I'm going to tell you what I heard. You tell me if I got it right. You are Israeli. Mm-hmm. You grew up in a very pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist home. And somewhere along the way in your own studies, you learn things that make you feel that in some way your early Jewish and Zionist education betrayed you, that there were things you were taught and took for granted as true, which you now feel were less than true. That's the comment you made to this room. And no one was able to give you a follow-up question. And so there are questions that the audience has. Can you give us one or two examples of the things that hurt you the most, that you feel are the most important distortions? I don't know if you want to say they're lies, but they were less than the complete truth, or maybe not truth at all. Give me one or two examples of the things that you now feel commonplace misunderstandings that Jewish education tends to feed those of us who grew up in the American Jewish world and in the Israeli world, which really are untrue.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to clarify myself. But I think the most fundamental thing that just comes to mind is just the map of Israel itself that we're shown growing up. I lived in an apartment with a couple of girls last semester, where one of the girls was very, very Zionist, and another one of the girls was involved with J Street U, two opposing organizations. And the girl who was in J Street, we had a map on our wall of Israel, the whole country, including the West Bank and Gaza, and that's the map that we're shown every day, growing up in Israel. And the girl who was involved with J Street was very against this map, and she wanted us to take it down. And this was when I first got to college, and I didn't really know anything yet, and I didn't understand how could she possibly have anything wrong. This is the map of Israel. This is all I've ever known. And then at that point, I had not even been told that there was any kind of debate about what the map of Israel would even look like. And the fact that the map of Israel might be something different than just the, that there might be a whole segment cut off, and maybe who knows in how many years that's even a debate. So that's the very first thing that comes to mind, is that even what Israel looks like on the globe is not even what I thought they would look like.
That's a very powerful example. I want you to know, in America, we're not shown that map. In America, the map is always the map of the Green Line. The West Bank is clearly delineated, as is Gaza. So we did not have that experience. Is there any experience of untruth that the American Jew shared or shares with you? Can you give me any other example of something you feel oh my goodness, I thought that my entire life, and now I know it's not true?
I guess the only other thing that can come to mind, I guess, is a very specific example, is in terms of, how did Israel come to be in the first place? And I think a lot of the narrative is just very distorted.
Give me an example.
For example, how did the Palestinians leave Palestine? Did they leave by choice or did they get kicked out? I've been told by many of the programs, that I honestly feel like I'm not sure if they purposely meant to distort the facts, but I've read other sources and courses that I've taken that have said that most of them were forced out, whereas my whole life I was told that either they left or they weren't even there in the first place. And that was a very hurtful point for me, because I think that if we're going to accept any sort of peace agreement, if we're going to try to understand the Palestinians in the first place, we need to understand that yes, they were there, and yes, they were forced out.
In your mind now, the majority of Palestinians, the majority of Arabs who are living inside Israel on May 14th, 1948 or thereabout, in your mind, most of them, the only reason they left was that they were forced out?
I don't know for sure. I can't say, but I want to say that, that what I was told was that they left. Their governments told them to leave. I don't think that's the whole story.
Is it part of the story?
It's definitely part of the story, but I know that it's not.
It's
the
not
whole
the
story.
whole story.
It's
Okay.
not the whole story.
Okay. What would you like to see Israel do in terms of the Palestinian population on the West Bank?
What I would want, ideally, just doesn't match up with what I know it has to happen. And I believe that all of the territory that Israel controls right now should belong to the Jewish people, but I know that that's not a realistic solution, and it's not a just one. The Jewish people need to have a state of their own, that I'm willing to give up parts of that territory that we have now in order to make that a reality, because I believe that as long as the occupation continues, that such a peace agreement just isn't going to happen, and that Israel, it's in Israel's best interest to have a Palestinian state, because as long as Israel, as long as this situation continues, Israel is either going to have to choose between being democratic and being Jewish, and that's not an option for me. That is not something that I'd want to choose between.
Are your parents still in Israel?
No, we live here.
Okay. Do you have any family in Israel?
Yeah, everyone else.
Okay. When you talk to them, do most of those members of your family agree with you?
They have legitimate security concerns, and I would share those also in terms of how do we actually take that idea that we believe in, how do we make it into realistic truth, because I think there's a lot of mistrust, and it's hard for me as someone who grew up in America to say that we can just trust and withdraw, because clearly that has not worked out in the past. So I can't really say for them, but they would be concerned. My uncle lives in Hadera, which is about you can see the hills of Judea and Samaria from his porch. So I would understand why he would be a little uncomfortable with such with the idea. So.
But it sounds like you would be uncomfortable also. Most Israelis say to me, we are prepared to make territorial compromise. We are prepared to have a Palestinian state on the West Bank with a Palestinian people who want genuinely to live with the state of Israel in peace. We would live side by side. And peace doesn't have to mean we're buddy-buddy, but it does mean that no child, either Palestinian or Israeli, has to walk in fear, and that no parent, Palestinian or Israeli, worries for the danger of their child because of either a Palestinian attack or an Israeli attack. That's what peace means. Most Israelis say to me, if you could guarantee me, if I believed that the Palestinians were ready to make that kind of peace, I would be happy to make territorial compromises and tear down virtually all of the settlements that have been built on the West Bank. That's what Israelis say to me. Do you think I'm being misled, or do you think that what I hear represents mainstream Israeli thinking?
I think that definitely represents Israeli mainstream thinking.
Okay. Well, maybe next year you'll be on a panel.
I hope so.
Dana Corin, thank you so much for the time. And again, this is the young woman who, again, for many people here, asked the most important question or made the most important point, and it's so kind of you to give us some time. Thank you. I wish you all the best. Go through it.